Hi, everybody. It's Joe Cioffi here on this Tuesday. I came on a little bit early with the developments that are happening this morning with respect to Hurricane Irma, which is now a Category 5 hurricane. Overnight, the hurricane was strengthened fairly rapidly. Maximum sustained winds are now 175 miles an hour. And you can see on the loop, the course looks like it is now slightly north of due west, and it's very important that we get this west-northwest course established very soon because it's getting dangerously close to the northern Leeward Islands. If it were to turn a little more west-northwest, it might just bypass all except maybe the two northernmost islands. But if it doesn't do it until late this afternoon or this evening, it could very well rake the entire northern Leeward Island chain. It is quite the impressive hurricane. I was just looking at the reconnaissance aircraft views, the reconnaissance reports flying in with the winds in excess of 134 knots. The Hurricane Center designated a top wind of 175, so I'll be curious to see what kind of a max wind they found in all that. And the latest recon reports, if I can, I'll find it for you. So just hang on one second. Here we go. Let me just freshen this up so we can have the latest on here. And you can see they made that second pass. Now look at the 2 points here, the pressures that were measured, the first point and the second point. This is the eye of the hurricane. This is the actual the reconnaissance reports are overlaid over a very, very tight view of the satellite, so you can see that really well-defined circular eye. Pressure's actually come up a millibar to 931, so it's possible that that phase of strengthening that took it down from 944.45 to 930, 15 millibars in about 8 to 10 hours, may have stopped for the moment. But look at these hurricane force winds that are showing up over a very large area. Of the blue, the purple, that is purple. The purple is 64 knots. So you've got hurricane force winds all along 18 degrees north. So a good 90 to 100 miles north of the center. This hurricane has really expanded its wind field. And when it was doing these eye wall replacement cycles, every time you get one of those eye wall replacement cycles completed, the eye expanded just a little bit. The wind field in the hurricane expanded a little bit. This has been one of these systems that's kind of been doing it in sort of a very slow, methodical way in terms of strengthening. So we have maximum sustained winds of 175 miles an hour. Let me just state in terms of what's going on with warnings. We have warnings for the Leewards, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. We have a hurricane watch up now for the Dominican Republic. I would suspect that at some point, maybe not today so much, but possibly by tomorrow, we'll have hurricane watches up for the Bahamas and later on, late this week, for Florida. And the risk for the Bahamas and for Florida continues to increase. Weather models overnight really have not backed away from anything that they've been showing for the last several days. And now we're starting to close inside the 5-day range where the models should get very reliable. And the hurricane tracking models, the new ones that came in that I saw from overnight, show a track up along the Florida coast, just inland of the coast, of the East Coast. And it's quite possible, by the way, that you could have not only a strong Category 4, Category 5 hurricane heading for the south for Florida and the southeast coast of the United States, but depending on the track, you could wind up with a situation where you could see hurricane force winds on both coasts of Florida at the same time. I mean, this is just kind of what some of the models are showing, with the track that literally splits its way up the coast, and you get half the circulation off the Atlantic, half the circulations over the Gulf of Mexico, and the hurricane itself is moving inland. But with a situation like that, it would be very, very slow to weaken because of the fact that the vast majority of the circulation is over very warm water on both sides of it. So let's hope that there's some change in the course, that it begins to, maybe veers a little bit more northward a little sooner. There's no sign of that yet on weather models. I think we could say that for the Northeast, the risk continues to diminish for any kind of direct hit. I think the risk increases for the southeast coast, for South Carolina and Georgia, because we could wind up with something that moves up north of along Florida, the Florida East Coast, and then emerges offshore for a brief time and heads into coastal Georgia and South Carolina. So I think that has to be looked at, and that the risk there is also increased somewhat, although I don't think the risk is at this point is as high as what it is for Florida and certainly for the Bahamas. So why don't we take a look at the latest weather video, and then we'll come back at the end and chat some. We have Hurricane Irma as a Category 5 hurricane sitting just to the east of the Leeward Islands right here. Look at that eye, just an incredible satellite loop this morning. And the eye is still moving along to the west. Maybe it's just a touch north of west, but the general movement is to the west. So if it doesn't start making this west-northwest turn soon, the eye is going to pass right over the northern Leeward Islands. It is really getting perilously close to time running out for the islands. If it would turn now to the west-northwest, the eye wall might just miss them, but it doesn't seem to be happening, at least on the satellite loop. And when we look at the recon that's just flying in now, we have a pressure of 930 millibars, and we do have a wind greater than 137 knots on the northeast side of the eye wall. Look at these winds here in the pink and the white. This area here, this is all 96 to 113. The pink is 113 to 137. I mean, they just all surround the eye wall. This is the pass that the plane is making. So the plane is now up here. So it came in from the southwest, flying up, and went right into the eye. Just incredible. Now they're going to make a second pass, and they are almost a good 60 miles away from the eye, and they're experiencing hurricane force winds. So the band of hurricane force winds extends out at least 60 miles to the northeast and to the north of the center, and maybe at about a little bit less than that to the south of the center. So the hurricane, just really, it's mind-boggling when they get to this when they get to this strength, because you just don't see it that often. Okay, so let's look at the hurricane track model guidance from overnight. Very, very tightly clustered. I think the confidence level is high, and the models are all about the same in terms of what they're doing, taking it west-northwest over the northern leewards and the Virgin Islands, just north of Puerto Rico, just north of the Dominican Republic, just north of Cuba, but through the Bahamas, and then making the turn right into South Florida and up through Florida northward and into Georgia and South Carolina. One of the things we're going to have to watch for, if there's a slight eastward shift, that you can wind up with the storm that goes just barely inland in Florida and then maybe emerges back out into the Atlantic here briefly, and maybe makes a second landfall in Georgia or South Carolina. So I think that the range is somewhere extends, from here to about here. I mean, that to me looks like the alleyway with regards to the track going forward. So let's look real fast at the GFS model from the overnight. And there it is, right over the leewards. And now that it's a Category 5 hurricane, I'm starting to think that maybe the GFS is not that far off with those pressures down near 900 millibars when it gets into the Florida Straits, assuming that it doesn't touch any of the larger island land masses. There you have it, moving over the northern leewards, over the Virgin Islands, just misses Puerto Rico. And then by Thursday afternoon, we're starting to get into the southeastern Bahamas. Continues to roll to the northwest, almost unyielding. Passes just north of the north coast of Cuba, and then starts to make the turn Saturday night into South Florida. Looks like it takes it almost right over Miami. And here's where the GFS just briefly emerges it east of Jacksonville and then brings it back inland somewhere in Georgia and South Carolina. I think that that's actually a fair track to anticipate. The European overnight, really quick, was to the east. I'm sorry, to the west of that. In fact, and it was a little further south, so it actually took a good core of the circulation onto Puerto Rico, then just north of the Dominican Republic, over the north coast of Cuba, and then turns it northward into the Florida Keys, and then straight north from there. Certainly a possibility. The longer it takes to turn to the west-northwest would open the door to a slightly westward shift in the track. And I feel pretty confident here. I think we're at the point now, just looking at what the overnight models did. They seem to all pretty much say the same thing in terms of the upper air. Upper dynamics. Here we go. So let's look at our upper air. And there's your deep trough in the east. Here's your jet stream, and this is where it's so how important it is in terms of how it's a matter of timing. Irma being here is under the ridge, okay, and it is protected from moving northward or northeastward. If Irma were in the Bahamas right now, it would catch this trough and probably turn northeast and northeast out to sea. But the trough lifts out, misses the the hurricane completely, and then with a weakness that gets left behind on the European, at least, it gets lifted up to the north, and then it's gone. The GFS upper air is perhaps just slightly, because it's slightly further east, maybe has a little bit more troughing down in the central Gulf states with the disturbance going by. But there's our trough in the east on the GFS here. Again, at the point we are at early Thursday morning, that trough is beginning to lift out. And you can see, by the way, the nose, here's the trough, and the bottom part of the jet stream is almost into northern Georgia, but the ridge is nosed back westward, right in there, okay? And that is going to keep this from turning northward and northeastward. So it rolls along to the west-northwest, the trough lifts out, and then you start to get this weakness here in the southern part of the jet stream that turns it to the north and then lifts it up northward up the west side of the Appalachians toward the track toward Pittsburgh. And by then it's become a non-tropical system, as we'll look on the surface map here and you can see it. It's actually quite an interesting little non-tropical cyclone that it develops. I'll get tighter. My coffee has not kicked in yet. You may hear that in my voice. But here it is on the tight eastern view on the GFS. Coming into Florida, over or just west of Miami, on up, back and out briefly over the water till it comes into South Carolina, and then up the spine of the, along or just maybe just right along the Appalachians, into western and central Pennsylvania as a fairly wrapped up cyclone. Now, if we get this track, by the way, here in the Northeast, we'll get some wind and rain from it, and it would be, I don't think it would be anything that we couldn't manage, but it might get, it could get a little rocky for a little bit in terms of wind gusts. I'm just curious about the winds. Yeah, I mean, it does have, it does show gales over the coastal waters, but I don't think this would be a huge deal if we wind up with a extratropical cyclone. It looks like almost like the kind of low that you would see sometimes in the wintertime when they go up the Ohio Valley to Pittsburgh. So it would not be something we couldn't manage. The problem would be for the Carolinas, certainly, and down through Florida. So, we've been talking about the risk areas increasing for the Bahamas, Florida, and the southeast coast. I continue to indicate that is indeed the case, and the risk is going up for those areas as we risk for a direct hit in the Northeast. To me, has diminished, I'm thinking that we don't really have to worry about that. Maybe there's still a bit of a small risk on the table, and a small risk that it could still turn out to sea, but those doors are beginning to close, and it looks to me like, Florida looks is going to be the target here for a Category 5 Hurricane Irma. So once we'll give one last look at the satellite loop before we'll come back and do a little chat. The barreling along here looks like it's still moving to the west, or maybe on a course slightly north of due west, and it needs to make that turn very soon. Otherwise, it's going to be going right over these northern Leeward Islands here: St. Martin, St. Kitts, Antigua, Anguilla, and the Virgin Islands are just to the west of that. So just stand by, and we'll come back over for a little bit of a chat. Okay, folks, I'm here. So let's just review a couple of things. First off, Category 5 hurricanes are not things that happen very often, and we haven't seen one in a couple of years. I believe Joaquin was the last one, and was a Category 5 briefly when it was in the Bahamas. That did not impact the United States. We'll have to see whether this one does. We've actually only had 3 Category 5 hurricanes make landfall in the United States. The Labor Day storm in the 30s, which I think still holds the record for the lowest pressure ever recorded. And this is Category 5 at landfall, okay? Not necessarily, there have been a lot of Category 5 hurricanes running around, but these are the 3 that have made landfall. Camille in 1969 on the Mississippi Gulf Coast near Biloxi and Gulfport, and the damage there was just catastrophic. And we also had Andrew in South Florida in 1992, I believe. So those are the 3, and we'll have to see if Irma remains a Category 5 hurricane when it goes further west. All the weather models do that. I was just looking at the new some of the new model plots. You know what? I can put them up here. So let's see if I can. Just give me 1 second. We'll do a little quick. I got to do a little quick technical stuff here. It'll just take a second. So let's let me find that. Oh, I know I remember where I did it. And I did it here. By the way, that's the latest recon pass. I showed that to you earlier. So let's see if we can get these hurricane model plots. Okay, so this is the new. These are the new plots. They've actually shifted a shade to the east. I've been kind of thinking, based on the fact that these have been more consistent than the global models. These might be better tools to use in this case. Now, the global models, the European, the GFS, and the Canadian, to some degree, pretty much lie within this cluster right up until the point it gets to just south of the Florida Keys, and then they start to vary a little bit with the GFS up the east coast of Florida, the European up the west coast of Florida, and the Canadian somewhere way out here. Notice that the Canadian model took it well out in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It is the outlier from where all the models are, and the hurricane cluster, the model cluster, takes it along and just inland of the Florida east coast, up the coast, and then brings it back out offshore and then into South Carolina or coastal Georgia. This is why I said that the risk for the southeast coast from South Carolina and Georgia has increased as well. along with, of course, obviously Florida. And just bear in mind again that if we do have a track like this, if we don't get a shift a little bit further to the east, or if we don't have something where it winds up passing a little bit offshore, if we have something like this, it's quite possible that we are going to see, in fact, it's highly probable, I would think, that we will see hurricane force winds on both the west and the east coast at the same time. The winds probably on the east coast would be stronger, but I certainly would not be surprised to see sustained hurricane force winds on the west coast as well. And moving it north inland like this, just inland, keeps the vast majority of the circulation. It may have the core of the circulation will be over land, but which will cause some weakening. But because you have the vast majority of the circulation over the waters on the Atlantic side and on the Gulf of Mexico side, the weakening would be very, very slow, and you would certainly see hurricane force winds and gusts for sure going all the way up through the state of Florida. So this is not a good track. This is, it's one thing to come in, say, moving from east to west across Florida and then out back into the Gulf of Mexico or the other way around. But to come in this way and move straight up northward where it just pretty much encompasses the entire state, that is not good overall. And then, of course, what emerges could still be a Category 3 hurricane, or maybe even a borderline 4. But let's just for argument's sake, let's say a 3. We could see a Category 3 emerge back out over the water and hold its strength as it moves further north into perhaps Georgia or South Carolina. So I'm thinking that this is where we're going to go with, this is where my idea is going with all this. And for those of you to the north, in the northern mid-Atlantic, the mid-Atlantic states, up to and the Northeast, I think the odds of a direct hit now are based on these tracks are low. I don't think the upper air sets up to bring something up the coast for a direct hit for those areas I just mentioned. I think the window of an out to sea solution, while still open, is closing. And let me just see. I'm trying to remember, Anthony, did Matthew actually, I know Matthew was Category 4. Did it actually reach Category 5 status briefly? I don't remember. My mind is telling me no, but I could be wrong on that. Plenty of fuel for Irma. Water temperatures is high. Yeah, water temperatures from here on in are in the middle and upper 80s. This is what you need to support a Category 5 hurricane. Usually you need water temperatures of about 86 degrees or higher, and you're certainly going to have that for the rest of the way. So I don't see anything that prevents this from being a Category 5 hurricane all the way across, as long as it remains, as long as the core of the hurricane remains over the water. The circulation could get disrupted a bit when it passes just north of the Dominican Republic and eastern Cuba, where the terrain is mountainous. But once it gets past that area, that's really the only thing that I could think of. As long as the core of the hurricane remains out over the water and is offshore by a fair distance of 60 miles or more, this should be able to maintain strong Category 4. Category 5 status from here on in. And there are going to be fluctuations in strength. We keep seeing these eye wall replacement cycles that have been going on. I think we might be at the beginning of another one. I'll put the Irma sat up. You can look at that well-formed eye. And, these eye wall replacement cycles, we're now over to the visible picture. I mean, you can actually see the depth of the eye. What happens is, the thunderstorms eventually peak out in the eye in terms of intensity, and then the eye wall begins to decay and a new wall forms and gradually expands. And what results from these eye wall cycles is that the hurricane wind field expands with each one, and the hurricane itself expands with each one. It has grown in size and coverage. I mean, you can see now we had a very, very small hurricane, but it looks like the core has expanded And you've got winds. You have hurricane force winds extending out almost 100 miles north and northeast of the center, based on the recon report. So this is going to be formidable. Again, waiting for that turn to the west northwest. It has not. It looks like it's starting to nudge a little bit further to the north, but it needs to make a little bit more of a nudge, a little bit of a sharper west-northwest course in order to avoid those northern Leeward Islands. And I think the chances of the hurricane moving over at least the northern the northernmost islands in the island chain appear to be fairly high. Let's see. And you're right, Anthony. 9 times out of 10, that trough in the east would be actually, it may be more like 19 times out of 20 that the trough in the east would have picked this up. But this is one of those rare circumstances where you have just enough of a ridge in between, and the trough lifting out so quickly that the hurricane basically misses it. That is fairly unusual. This would normally be a situation for a recurve, and that's the other thing. The fact that it is so far, that movement west-southwest was so important to the track in the longer term, because putting it at a further south latitude also keeps it further away. If this had wound up at about 24 or 25 north, where the original guidance had it before making 70 or 75 west, this would have recurved into that trough and it would have been out to sea. It might have skimmed the eastern Bahamas, but that would have been it. And if you remember, a lot of the early model plots had it only as far west as the eastern Bahamas, and we've been coming in further south every single day for the last 5 days or so, and made a now we're also looking at what happens once it reaches 80 degrees west, and it seems there that we're seeing models nudging a little bit further to just a shade further east, shade further east, shade further east over the last couple of runs. So that's going to weigh the risks between, for the southeast coast of the United States. The track a little bit further the east now is going to, start to increase the risk for South Carolina and Georgia a bit more. I'm thinking that, for a landfall in North Carolina might be at this point pushing it. We can't completely rule it out. We'll have to watch also for the longer range whether once inland does it move up the Appalachians. The European wants to hook it westward, which is what some of the models were doing early, a few days ago. Now we've got these sort of varied solutions with a low moving up the Appalachian Mountains, which would bring some wind and some rain to the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. But that I think we're going to have to examine when we get a little bit closer. It's right now. There's just has to be, we have to see where the landfalls are going to be. If we see one in Florida and then see one in the southeast coast before we can figure out what any kind of impacts might be further north. I mean, when I look at the GFS, to me, it looks like a winter-type storm in a sense, in terms of when it becomes a non-tropical cyclone. But that is down the road in its future. Okay, folks. So this is the stream that I think I was going to do at noon, so I was able to do it a bit earlier. I'm hoping that I can do a live stream tonight from Fios One News, where I practice my craft on the daily basis for Long Island and New Jersey. Hopefully we can get some technical issues resolved, and I would be able to do that. In the meantime, you can check the latest website posts at meteorologistjoecioffi.com, and also take a look at Angry Ben's view of Hurricane Irma and all things New York City on nycweathernow.com. We may have some thunderstorms here to deal with late this evening, once with the cold front coming through. And that front is one of the keys with this next trough swinging into the east that is going to be, part of the whole Irma equation going forward. So everybody have a great day. We will hopefully talk to you later. If I can't live stream this evening, if I do live stream this evening, I will schedule it so you can see it. If not, I will schedule one for when I get home tonight, which would be probably around or just after midnight. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.